issue?
Well, I'm going to introduce kind of the program here. This is, we put in the paper the Goose Committee. Really, there's 2 people on the Goose Committee so far. Dave Myers was appointed to head the Goose Committee. Yeah, and John Berquist is kind of
I would
by de facto.
No, nobody's officially.
Yeah, and I think Stan Broden is wanting to be involved with it. We want to get some people involved in trying to come up with solutions to solve the overabundance of residential geese is what I kind of been using that term. And the idea behind this meeting tonight was to bring somebody in from Wildlife Services, and John Berquist has brought a gentleman here who he deals with this issue and with a lot of communities up here, or communities contact him about problems with geese and probably other animals, I would assume. And so that's what the intent of the meeting is. The small group here, we had quite a large meeting and we said we were going to hunt them, which was kind of fun. But you know, there's other things going on. That's why we were going to record this and put it on the cable so people can see the presentation and whatnot. So. How it's going to go, we're going to have, John's going to introduce the speaker a little bit, and then we're going to have the presentation. There'll be time for anybody who wants to ask questions, whatnot. And then Dave will probably talk about maybe the next steps based on the presentation and whatnot. So I'm going to turn it over to John Berquist, and let him introduce the speaker.
Thank you, Darcy. Well, our speaker tonight is Chad Alberg. Chad's with Wildlife Services, U.S. Department of Agriculture, and their charge is to handle nuisance animals as one thing. They also have a plant division. Chad's worked with the goose problem for a number of years around the state or in the northern part of the state. So in Wildlife Services, instead of the DNR is contracted with Wildlife Services, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, to actually handle complaints and meet with groups and talk about what can be done to address the problem. There's a number of different things. Some work, some don't. So with that, Chad, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. Good evening.
Good evening.
Before we started, I was able to chat a little bit, so I got a sense of kind of where Amery seems to be at this time. Bear with me, I'll go through this whole thing, but because I think it's relevant still, and it's important to anyone who jumps in the middle of this to I think get the whole background. And know everything about these birds. John told me, said who I was. I have an office in Cumberland. I've been there, this will be my 19th year. We do a number of, basically we are Wisconsin's, let's just jump to that. And let me go full bigger screen here, sorry. Nationwide, we kind of provide federal leadership in wildlife damage management. We've done it in Wisconsin since about the mid-80s. Our role here varies. Our role in each state in the country varies. It depends on what our cooperators and us have established. The cooperator in this case mainly being the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. They are the state agency that is really in charge of managing wildlife populations in the state. Now, when migratory birds, or let's just say migratory birds are part of it, they sometimes have to, I don't know if co-manage is the right word, there's another word we use these days than co, but the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service also comes into play, and I will mention that in a little bit. One more plug to throw in for us, we are not a regulatory agency. So what I'm telling you today was created by the regulatory agencies, the 2 I just mentioned, Wisconsin DNR and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We are basically relaying the law and code to you on this. Okay, so the messenger in most cases. And I'll try to move through the beginning because I think I know where we're at in Amery, and we'll get to the bottom line towards the end. But it's very important, I think, to mention a little bit about Canada geese in Wisconsin. And let me just say too that Amery's pretty darn fortunate to have John living here, because you could argue he was Mr. Waterfowl in Wisconsin for quite a long time, and that's a little concerning to me when I'm going to talk about stuff that he knows in his sleep. Okay? But I know most people see a Canada goose and it's a Canada goose. Well, to biologists it's not. We actually have kind of two distinct birds in this state. Everyone thinks of the birds flying overhead, and twice a year you're seeing them high and honking, and we kind of consider them migrants, and the common eye probably isn't going to be able to tell them apart. The reason the two birds are significant is really where they do their life functions, where they breed or raise their young. One does it in the upper reaches of Canada, the other fulfills all its life functions here in Wisconsin. Those pretty much are the birds we're talking about. The giants or resident Canada geese. Resident's pretty easy to understand. They live right alongside us all year long. Okay? They are typically the bird we're discussing, especially if the issue are broods and loafing birds in May, June, and July on public use or private use areas. Okay? Those are the birds we're talking about. It's important to separate them because they're managed quite differently, and I'll touch on that in a second. But just a little bit about them. They're highly successful for a reason. They've adapted to us. Most wildlife that thrive in decent numbers do so because they've adapted to change in their habitat and to our presence. And geese are quite capable of doing that. At one time, it was thought basically these birds were gone. And for the most part in Wisconsin, they certainly were. From wildlife managers or wildlife biologists' perspective, they are a huge success story. Now, too much of a good thing isn't always great. I try to tell my daughter that at candy time. But some birds were found. There's argument about where they were found, but that doesn't really matter. Through stocking programs, we went from just a little over 1,000 birds some 40 plus years ago to, well, somewhere in this region today, maybe 150,000 would be a good number in the state. Don't look at the colors and stuff. John might know what that means, but that's not important to us here. Just look at that long-term trend. For at least a decade now, we've had a population close to that 150,000. Or it's kind of the trend of the population here. I don't know what that 03 bar is. Maybe that was just really excellent survey results that year or something like that. So I would just say, given how high it is, it doesn't seem completely right. But
and that 150,000 is the resident?
Correct, yes. Well, yes, the Wisconsin Canada goose resident, yes, birds. Now that number probably swells at certain times of the years, but those are birds that are coming through and moving on. Now those birds are probably a visitor to Amery, and we'll get a decoying effect, and we'll talk about that in a second. I just touch on this briefly. Geese are susceptible to mortality a number of ways. Humans are probably the largest cause. These are some of the natural. I would have liked to add a couple more. I think there should be probably an eagle, a picture of an eagle up here. Certainly as far as goslings go, I think they can take their share, and we certainly have eagle numbers that are all-time highs. There's been studies of geese are most vulnerable probably to native predators at nesting time. And there's been studies of urban Canada geese versus rural. A prairie pothole or a cattail pond in a rural environment. There's been nesting success studies between the two, and they're considerably different. Put it this way, urban Canada geese nest pretty successfully, almost 90% success. It's closer to around 46% is what I read today in rural settings. I would even argue that's a little low. It may be even higher than that. Geese are pretty good birds at defending their nest. They're adaptable. Certainly none of the terrestrial predators I showed you on the previous slide are going to do anything to these two nesting locations on the left, are they? I'm not sure what they're thinking the goslings are going to do when they hatch, but those are rooftops, and you can see the setting, some of the settings that geese are found in Wisconsin. It's not settings where we'll find some of the other predators. Certainly raccoons would be in some of those areas though. I throw this in just as as another side to how productive and also adaptable they are, I'm going to talk about some techniques you can do other than just removing birds in a little bit. But some of those techniques, and you know, the photo can't show you everything, but just in the background here is a dense wall of cattail, probably over our heads. And it's quite wide. It's probably the width of this room wide. Normally we consider that ideal to ring a water body, because geese like that openness. If you visualize where the problems are in the city, are they in open settings? Golf courses, lawns, school fields. That's what they like. They like that vision. So that, well, I'll touch on this in a minute, but that can be things you can do to prevent them. Well, in this case, they had a cow path through those cattails. And the city, this is in Cumberland last spring, and the city hadn't mowed this until mid-July. It was looking like a hayfield. I'm not sure why, maybe to reestablish the sod there or something. But I just had been watching those because Cumberland's going through the same goose pains Amery is, and I've been watching the birds. And I've been watching this pair, and I realized, John, this could be a gang brood, and that's what we refer to as groupings of young that come together, but the size was identical. There was no size variation here. And I realized nesting can occur closely, but you can also get very large variation. Maybe you've seen that in the city. Late nests and very early nests. But there was 17 in this picture, and I watched them for a week, and I never saw another adult pair. So I don't know. I'm not saying that this pair had 17 goslings, but they certainly raised 17 for a time. And they may have not all made it. I kind of gave up on watching them because as they get larger, they begin to increase the area they visit each day. But nonetheless, impressive abilities here. And they were kind of, for a little bit, I would lose the goslings in the tall grass. This was the best place where I could get a shot of them all together. But the grass was, and they were having a field day, actually hunting insects in there, which is high protein and makes goslings just grow like weeds. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on what geese can do negatively, at least in the human's eye. These are all obvious things. This looks more like a pasture, but it was all goose used. Some droppings and feces content, that's a whole nother subject. The amount of nutrient loading that can occur from goose feces. I did read something today, I was trying to brush up on this. There's nitrogen in those droppings, but they don't think a lot of that gets returned to terrestrial settings, but in a water setting, it certainly can. So the reason for that is the nitrogen is just coming from that grass and it's kind of going right back. It's not really an added nutrient. It's just changing composition a little bit. I love that photo if you can see that. It almost has to be staged. I don't know how you could wait that long for somebody like that to get chased by a goose. But anyway, a bunch of other concerns that can exist. This is pretty excessive conditions here. We briefly were talking about the airport before. That's a whole another subject that we won't really touch too much here. But if anyone remembers in 2009, that is US Airways Flight 1549, it was a pretty significant event. Yes, it was caused by Canada geese ingestion into main engine 1. I have that proof right here. This is from our agency who did the inspection of that engine afterward. It says engine 1, and it's a Canada goose feather. So anyway, that story was big because of, obviously, they can end a lot worse than that. Well, shouldn't even have the answer to this. You can tell what's wrong with this. Does the city right now have anything in this direction? Already exists? Is there a feeding ordinance at the public use areas? If there isn't, okay. If there isn't, you should at least post something that there is, or actually get it created. You cannot begin to address this problem without this being one step in the process. Okay?
I think there is some type of ordinance.
There is definitely.
I would-
It's not posted on the signs, it's just the signs are there.
Okay. I just can't stress enough that you cannot begin to get serious about the subject without this being a component. It's cart before the horse kind of thing. Okay, and maybe it's not as large of a problem here. I'm not completely familiar with the public use areas or the parks, but normally in cities, this is where it begins. It begins at a park and a feeding, and it all starts pretty innocently enough. Interestingly, again, when I was reading today, in Minnesota, they did a study of this. They believe that the threshold number, or the number where geese begin to generate calls to people like yourselves, decision makers or public figures, is about 60 birds. Before that, everything's pretty calm and collect, and after that number, that's where you start to see stuff. And I think it's pretty close, and maybe it gets above 100, now things really start going. It just depends on how spread out they are. But anyway. Again, I'm going to move through these fast, because I think we're at a step that's beyond this a little bit. These are things that can work, and I mentioned that cattail edge in Cumberland. It would be ideal, and it wasn't even purposely planned. That's just how that is, and it still didn't really work. This site here, it's a water retention basin. It has a nice, thick, dense wall of vegetation. It may or may not do that job. So I don't completely sell this as the solution. Okay. Also, I think this here is an example of very inviting goose country. It's easy to access. This, I'm not exactly sure. I don't think that looks good, period. But that would not prevent geese from entering that shoreline, because look at the upper left. They would not have fenced that if that riprap area there had done the job for geese. It was probably there for some other reason, probably erosion control. But anyway, here's a number of other non-natural exclusion options. And sometimes even a barrier like this can be used in conjunction with a natural barrier where that's hidden inside of it. Now, obviously, if you have a park or a beachfront and you fence it, the purpose of it's probably to allow people access to the water. Well, this kind of prevents that too. So it is not a solution in all locations. But if the golf course has land areas that go right down to the water, and that's what they're accessing, and humans don't need to get into that water, those are options in those locations, at least for walk-in birds. And we'll talk about that in a little bit too. You know, here's where a municipality took an existing fence and just kind of modified it a little bit. Because generally, most of the time we're talking about birds that are walking from the water to the land area, not flying in. If they are flying in, those overwater grids work excellent.
In that lower right-hand corner, is
Yep.
there a fence in there?
Yeah, maybe hard for you guys to see. There's a couple strands of wire that they added to the decorative fence.
Okay, just below the first rough wood.
Right here. Yep. I question whether that would work, actually. I would think it'd need to be a better barrier. But the principle is there. You're using what exists and modifying it a little bit. The upper picture shows that from a distance where you don't even see it. I mean, that's a pretty aesthetically pleasing waterfront, and they were trying to keep it that way and not create a big barrier. These have applications to some areas. Granted, not every location. Won't spend a lot of time on these either. I think Amery is probably past the point of this. These are techniques that can have some success when you have populations in the range at which you're attempting to manage for. Okay. If you have numbers exceeding what are going to be tolerable to most of the stakeholders, this stuff's probably not going to work, or simply going to move them to other locations. But they can have some applicability to places. The city of Rice Lake actually used some dogs. They actually used just private dog owners who were me included, who were given permission to let their dogs have a field day. And you know, for a while it works pretty well, and then towards the end they do kind of realize the dog turns away, or the owner makes that dog turn away, you know, and not continue. We talked about management authority in the beginning. These were the two agencies that said that ultimately decide that, but it is a local decision. That's why we're meeting in this room. Neither agency would become involved if the city of Amery was quite content with their geese. You make the decision and the call to further manage within the jurisdiction here. Going to go into some management approaches and what both of the two agencies you saw just do. Okay. Remember we talked about the two different populations of Canada geese, the migrants and the residents? Well, they're both targeted through hunting a little differently. It's been, what, 15 years at least since the early goose season's been around, probably?
Longer than that.
Oh, 2 decades probably? Okay. Well, it's something that came about with when you would have saw that graph of increase, okay? And it's just like it says, it's to target these birds, okay? That's generally just before migrants are arriving. I've seen migrant flocks the 13th of September, but it's very close, okay? We're getting right on that cusp. The second season encompasses basically, it doesn't just target migrant birds, but since they're here in numbers large enough to get targeted, the season changes, it's long, and the bag limits drop way down. The last number I saw said that that season probably comprises of 50 to 60% giant birds, somewhere in there. So we're
migrant season?
Yeah, this late season.
About
So we're still
50%.
shooting resident birds at that point.
Absolutely, absolutely. But you're getting a lot of movement and mixing and feeding, increasing flights, agricultural feeding. You don't really at that point know exactly if you're targeting City of Amery birds. You probably pretty much know you are with this season. Okay. That is a season I cannot stress enough here. And you've already moved in that direction, it sounds like, partially. This is where we'll focus now. I think it sounds like Amery's probably at population management stages, and you have two options here to reduce numbers. You remove adult birds, or you reduce recruitment, okay? You reduce how many are added each year. And in turn, that should reduce how many you have to remove at the end, okay? I really don't think you can you certainly can't do one without the other. You could maybe do it the other way around, but you're going to constantly be doing it. Number one, it sounds like you've moved in that direction. Consider improving, modifying, expanding, increasing use. That's certainly a large component, and I applaud the city for moving that direction. The main reason is it's almost absolutely free. The participants actually paid to do that. Okay. You cannot beat that. The other two are going to cost you something. The second one, and we'll go through it in a little bit larger, or a little more in depth here in a second. This one is the one that's working to reduce recruitment the following year or successive years. It's generally a little more palatable to the general public. Okay? I will say that. It generally gets accepted more as a technique than adult removal does. Obviously, it's limiting the growth of population. The technique here is not to just go out there and take the eggs home for dinner or throw them in the pond. It's actually to just limit the egg's ability to survive. You actually are ceasing that egg's function, but you're leaving it there. And you're doing that purposely to make that bird believe that it's still nesting. Because if you get rid of that, it's going to re-nest. And you're going to constantly be in a cycle until you get to a point of time at which their body says that reproduction's done for the year. We have to move on. So oiling limits re-nesting. That's a big part of this. Okay, and then at which time time passes and these birds give up on reproduction.
From an oiling standpoint, what are you spraying on?
Good question. That's simply, I believe the Fish and Wildlife permit only allows corn oil now. It's just simple corn oil.
And you just spray on the, you have to coat the entire egg or?
Yeah, you get it sprayed all the way around. There's another technique called Addling, which is just kind of a vigorous shake that's internally kind of destroying the function. Some places do both. This really is normally all that's needed. The egg has a very permeable membrane, and the oil is sealing that basically. Okay. It's making that membrane the oxygen cannot.
What kind of success do they have locating goose nests? Because that seems to me to be, you'd have to spend some time locating enough nests to make any difference.
That's a very, very good question.
The pass will over.
I would say initially, you'll have some difficulty. It's a learning curve. The city of Rice Lake has been doing this probably for 5 or 6 years now. The first year they found about 8 nests. Last year they found 45. They're getting good at it. They're starting to learn where they are, where to look. They've actually expanded their look area. They're getting more efficient at doing it so they can cover more area in the time they have allotted to do it. Obviously they have other important functions to do, but they have seen the results of this. It has been very critical.
Another question, in Rice Lake, is the city doing that? Is it the city crew?
In that case, the department within the city does do it, yes.
They don't utilize any volunteers?
I have attempted to have them do that. Mainly the volunteers or the citizens have given them tips as to where to find, or they've allowed them access to their properties, okay? Because the permits generally are good for city-owned land within a geographic area. They'll get other properties, but obviously they can't be entered without that permission. And that would limit how much you could cover as well. And are you going to get all of the nests with this? No, not even close. And that really isn't the goal. It's to target the birds that are right here, that as soon as that brood is hatched, that will show up to the areas in discussion within that week. I'll keep moving on, and as questions arise, just let me. This process, if this hasn't been done already, this should be started. You should get this begun. It's very simple. The cost to obtain the permit is nothing, which is rare these days. And it just requires a little bit of record keeping and reporting at the end of the period. It's for a window of time. Well, obviously there isn't nests for past a certain window of time, but the permit's only valid for a certain period as well. We talked about the hunting season. We talked about egg and nest destruction. The last step towards population management is actual adult bird removal. Okay, it's typically it's always done during the flightless stage, when geese and most birds actually undergo an annual molt, but especially waterfowl. And during this time, they're vulnerable to everything because they're flightless. So you'll find them most often on large water bodies where they can go swim out and escape any kind of dangers. But this is the time that roundups are conducted.
What do you do with them after you capture them? Do you kill them or do you relocate them somewhere else?
No. Relocation is no longer an option for a roundup.
Okay, so you round them up and you...
That was done 10 plus years ago. There are no longer areas that geese can be moved that do not have geese. So no, they're not relocated. But what becomes of that bird at that point is up to the body here. You have a couple options, okay? Well, and a couple are listed here. Traditionally, they have been tested because in some of the urban areas geese are found, they wanted to be sure there wasn't contaminants and levels that exceed safe human consumption. and actually only one municipality, I believe, tested too high for human consumption. And I've just learned of this, well, here are those numbers. Or I've learned that I believe the option can exist to have a municipality decide to just have those birds processed or not, or provided whole to captive wildlife facilities. On the bottom there it says captive animal feed. There's been a captive carnivore center in northeast Wisconsin that has taken quite a few of them, and they're fed that way. Yes.
Those birds are fed to carnivores.
What do you mean?
Not
Like a
people.
zoo, they give them to like...
They're euthanized.
Yes.
Without using any chemicals or anything, and they're used for animal feed. For
Like a bear or bobcats or...
Wolves, foxes,
Sure.
yeah, canines.
Yep.
Yeah.
And who does the roundup? Is that trained, it says trained wildlife services staff?
Who you decide to have do a roundup is up to you. We are available for that and can enter into agreements and contracts for that.
If you're involved, you have a fee to charge.
Absolutely. If we are involved, we do nothing for free. Yeah. Remember what I said in the beginning, the management of this rests within the jurisdiction, and so does the cost. Now, this would be a good segue into this. The Department of Natural Resources has an urban wildlife damage control grant available. It's small, it's a big state. There's a lot of urban issues. It's a small grant. I believe it's about $25,000 annually. I can provide whoever wants this.
It's available, and I don't have the information with me. It's available to larger municipalities.
I would argue that it would be available to anybody if your project had the merits.
That's not what I was told.
Well, I've seen some smaller ones get it. You're right. Wisconsin Rapids isn't that large.
No, but it's on,
I have the list of recipients from this year.
it's not available to us.
Is the total grant from the state's 25,000,
Yeah.
25,000
Yeah, and it's
per grant?
No, that's the total amount of money that's
Total.
available.
And it's cost shared up to
But it's
50.
not available to us, because I've already checked that.
Okay. So what does a roundup cost?
Eligible urban communities, that might be the
Yeah,
catch,
that's the key. It's something to do with
can receive 50% cost share grant to a maximum of
some
5,000.
transportation notation on cities, and Amery does not fall into the
It did
group
not.
that gets it. Yeah.
Okay.
No,
And let's not talk about that.
I was hoping it did.
You was hoping it did?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Chad, what's the cost for a roundup?
It varies, and it would depend on the scale at which we were trying. I guess I don't really want to get detailed on that right now. If Roundup's where we're going, we can get detailed after that. And it would kind of require that we look over the area, we see what the situations are, if it's only a one day deal or not. These used to be the 100% guidelines, and I believe there's ways around this. Now, this is the highest cost alternative to a Roundup because it requires the testing. So right there, based on those numbers, and I believe it's a little less than 200 now. I believe it's not that high. And we've gone to a different lab, so you can get it done a little bit less than that. But if you decide that it's only palatable to the citizens to take these birds, euthanize, and process them for consumption, this is the route you'll have to take. But it'll cost the testing and increased transportation to the processors, and there's very few of them that we can go to. Very few.
So is that $200 a bird?
Yes.
Yeah, and I believe it's more around 150 now. Yeah.
But if we shoot them, we don't have to test them?
During the early goose hunting season?
Yeah.
No. No, because that is not being done, that hunt is not being done, so to speak, under the authority of the city of Amery. Like a roundup and a donation is coming from the city of Amery. Should those birds turn into little packets of ground meat and they're donated somewhere, that's a different liability issue.
What if people, are you able to just donate, you take the bird and you process it yourself? Like, we did some of that during our hunt, people who wanted them, and probably the people that we gave them to needed the meat, because for various reasons. They asked the hunters, and we gladly gave it to them. Are you allowed to do that here? You're saying testing them if we're gonna have a process?
Not under a roundup,
You can't do that.
no. We are rounding up a trailer load full of birds, maybe 70 to 170 birds. They have to be transported to the location where they're euthanized, and then from there they're going as a unit to somewhere.
Okay.
Individual handouts at that point have to be done through this system.
That's 70 to 170, that's a pretty decent average for a roundup?
There is no average.
No, but I mean, is that...
Typically, if we're involved and you're going to be spending considerable dollars to do this, I think it needs to be worth it. You need to get the bang for your buck. So yeah, and remember I talked about 60 being a threshold, and we don't, where problems seem to erupt or phones begin to ring, and we never leave with every bird either. And that isn't the goal. The city really needs to try to decide, and this is hard. This is even hard for professionals. Kind of needs to decide what population they're comfortable with, what number, or what factors will kick in to say, okay, we do something again, or we're okay for a while now.
Just to give you a little bit of idea about Amery, we have 13 parks, and I think one of the parks isn't on water. And just in the beach, we probably had a couple times they had to scare them off, 200 maybe at one time. And that was during time.
Is every park visited by geese?
Mostly it's, well, I don't know. The river and the South Twin are much more advantageous for the birds. North Twin, rarely, they do land there, but they don't stay around much because there's more activity out there and there's a lot of speedboats and things.
Well, again, these specific locations to target are things that can be addressed if we move towards a roundup, because those are things we need to know. And if we only have a window and we have a day, normally we go to the places that provide the best access and the most bang for the buck. We won't chase a 15-bird flock.
Yeah. Well, like Stan Broden in his yard, how many can you have there, Stan? Hundreds?
60 to 100.
Yeah, depends on the time of year.
That may be an excellent location right there. And those are the kind of things that I determine ahead of time, those locations.
See, where I live is right on the edge of the city, right next to the township next door, and all these geese that come, not on this Twin Lake out here, but that come on the river and come into town and on the streets and some of the parks downtown, they, as far as I can tell, are all hatched in a backwater area behind, right next to my place. Because when I see them coming into my yard, that's the first place they show up, and then as they start getting a little bigger and can swim a little further with their babies, then they head downtown and spread out all over on the streets. And stuff.
You know that one photo you showed about you said you thought it's possible that the two adults there were the 17 birds, but you weren't sure? Well, I have a photograph that my wife took of 2 birds helping 15 walk across the street down by Stan's house, or down by his neighborhood. So the birds around here are having...
There's been observed goslings with a pair close to 40, and they're definitely game broods.
Yeah.
Those 15 to 17 are game broods.
They probably are.
It's a dominant pair that will take birds, goslings from another younger pair. And that's not a...
It probably isn't biologically feasible.
No.
Well, how many times do they nest during the year? I mean, now, like on South Twin, come March, they'll line up on the edge. They stand there and they just wait for that water to open up on the edge. They'll stand on that ice floe. But then later, then they'll have their batch, that first batch. But later, then more come. Do they have more than one hatch?
If they have goslings, if they had goslings at any point in time, that's all they can get off in a year. They're not having a second brood.
Okay.
They're not robins from that standpoint.
You don't think so?
No, you are simply seeing other pairs that just nested later. Maybe.
If once they hatch, the goslings, within a day or two,
then they won't.
they won't be able to nest again. But if the nest is destroyed, say on day 27, in a typical is 28 days for once the clutch is laid. If it's destroyed on day 27, she may re-nest again. So that's almost a month later you're going to see Fluffy down.
Oh, probably more because they only lay one egg a day, or do they lay more?
No, it's an egg per day and a half typically.
So if you got a clutch of 15 eggs, that's 18, 19 days.
No, that's.
And then,
It would be
and
too
then
long,
28
yeah.
days gestation.
But you don't have a clutch that size. 8, 9 is the max that you're going to
Look
find.
at that one picture they got.
That they'll lay, or that they will.
They'll lay at a time in a clutch.
If you become involved with nest and egg searching, you really get to see what it is. It's really, it's 2 to 6 is what it really is.
Ducks will lay, from 9 to 15 eggs in a clutch. I know.
Is it true that,
These are bigger eggs.
Yeah, there's a lot of bodily energy being expended to get an egg of this size out. It's very taxing to do that, and so that's why you'll see the smaller clutch.
now I was led to believe that the birds that grow up in one area come back and, when they, 2 years or whatever it is, when they can have a family, they come back to that same place where they grew up.
The females will come back to the general area,
Okay.
not to the same spot. But a female who successfully nests may nest in that same spot the next year, in the following year,
Yeah.
in the following year. So that's where,
Hence the population increase.
yeah, that's where if you do some nest searching, you want to go back and look at those sites where there was, or it could be very close by. And she may not too, she may be a mile away. But it's the goose, not the gander, that comes back typically to the same general area.
So in my area of the river, now there are about 300 or 400 there. And in the spring, there are only 2 nests.
Right now, you're saying today there's wintering birds. Yeah.
And so just 2 nests.
Right.
And they're the same spots. And so it's the same 2 females then in that, what you're saying,
Well,
that have chosen that and have been successful. And so that's kind of interesting too.
In a
So
very
where are
short
all
period
those
of
nests?
time,
Yeah.
probably 2 weeks, you're going to start seeing pairs heading across the countryside and standing on frozen ponds, and they will defend those aggressively during the initial time. So I talked to somebody 2 days ago. She has a pond behind her house. She truly believes it was the same pair for almost 9 years.
Oh, I'm sure.
And that's very likely. It probably is very, very likely that it is. And that's what you're seeing too. You're seeing 2 pairs being highly aggressive in defending their nesting area. Somehow that can be diminished in urban settings. You can go on some of the pictures I showed of that real congested, it was Milwaukee. We do a lot of work for Milwaukee. There can be 5 nests in an area the size of this building. And I just don't know, they've adapted to that apparently. There's not a lot of choices.
Because there's limited choice.
Yeah.
How much space do they normally use? I mean, how much do they protect?
That's up to the individual goose and gander to
You know,
decide.
that pond by Slumberland down there, there's for 30 years, 25 years at least, there's been one pair that nested in that pond. That pond is less than an acre.
Yeah, typically that size pond, you only normally expect to see one pair.
But when there's water across the street,
Yeah.
then
May
there
well
will be
be another
another pair nest there. So they're within, 80 yards of each other.
If we would employ you for a year, then our local employees could learn your strategies and continue with that in future years.
As far as the nest and egg goes?
No, the
roundups?
Roundup.
Well, you'd have to confer with DNR on that, because you'd have to then meet transportation standards, what you're gonna do with those birds. Generally, I don't know of any municipalities that have done their own roundups.
But it sounds like when you're looking at the options, the first option is what we started last year, and that's the hunt. And I think, my impression anyway, is that we want to continue to do that. And we want to expand it into going into the nest sites and begin to spray the eggs in combination with that. And then see whether or not sometime in the future, if that isn't successful, are we continuing to have big problems is looking at the Roundup, because the Roundup is the most expensive.
Those are your decisions to make.
Yeah.
And somebody else may say, we're at Roundup time now, and then we'll start seeing success from reducing recruitment, and we'll get a few years out of improvements. Some may not.
It seems
There's
to me one of
opinions.
the issues that we had this year is we didn't start our first we really only had one concentrated day for removing them. And we didn't start that till, what was it, about the 20th of September before we had our first removal day?
It was late, yeah.
So had we been able to hold 3 of them and hold them, starting like the 2nd or 3rd or whatever, and then every few days, because it was effective. We did effectively remove the geese from the golf course.
Remember,
After that one shoot that we had out there, and we killed like 8 or 9.
Yep.
And they didn't have a significant goose issue after that. We had a few later, maybe in October, that would land, but they were pretty,
But patterns for the year are changing in the goose world by then,
Oh yes,
too.
I understand that.
And grass is becoming less of a component of their diet, so the use of those areas will probably diminish. You did nothing to alleviate May, June, and July's issues.
Right. And that's, killing 2 of them in September means that they hatched 6 or 7. You
Maybe you could have took 2 juveniles that weren't going to be raising young for a couple of years yet. Who knows? I'm not diminishing.
The other place that I noticed, I shot at the airport a couple times and dramatically reduced the geese. So you can reduce them in one particular area, but the school had 500 of them out on the football field and the softball fields, because they moved from the golf course and the airport over to those.
Well, my concern is that, if we, you go down the path and you say, well, we gotta get to the point of removing the geese, and it's costing us $200 a goose, 100 geese cost you $20,000.
Okay,
That's if you're donating them.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
Let me clarify that. That test would be a one-time deal, and I think they're good for 3 to 5 years. I'd have to check on the exact date. Okay, but that 5 goose testing would be a one-time thing. You wouldn't have to do that every
year. You only
year.
have to test five of the geese?
Correct.
You don't have to test them all?
10%.
Normally 5 is
Okay,
sufficient.
all right, no.
So we collect 70 geese, we only need to test 5 of those.
Okay, gotcha.
No.
That's a lot different.
Yeah,
Financially, yeah.
glad you asked that. No, it wouldn't be to that level.
Yeah, because if it's $200 a bird, you might as well donate people Kobe beef. All the price of that.
It's a valid.
That'd be a better problem.
It's a valid point.
They're running around town.
Roaming the streets.
And that's why the Department of Natural Resources created a little leeway in that area, because it was getting costly to do all that. The processing was getting more and more difficult to find somebody who could do it. They had to be a state inspected facility. Last year we were down to 2 in the state. So if birds from Amery have to go to, I think it was almost to Anago, that's cost. It's a lot of
Question
cost.
here. Now, we're on the border. What if there's a processor in Minnesota? How does that work?
Complicated, generally.
It's gotta be a lot cheaper than driving to Anago.
Right.
But if we were to just so I'm correct, if we are to donate them to a,
Captive animal facility?
do we need to test those?
No.
Okay, and there's no cost for processing? Or-
No.
Just transportation.
But there
Yes.
would be a cost for capturing and
Right.
transporting.
There'd be
Yeah.
the process, the actual process that you're seeing here, and as you can see, there's more than one person involved. But if there's city staff available, we do consider that, because then we can reduce the staff we need to bring longer distances. We're kind of scattered about the state. And you know, if I need 6 people right there, and instead I only need 4, well, that helps on cost too.
I heard a program on Wisconsin Public Radio, and they were talking about how they were doing this in Madison. And it sounded like from the report that they had a lot of volunteers that showed up to help out. Now, what if that was an available resource as well? I mean,
That would help.
training that you have to do for them?
We could probably get more sites done in the same amount of time, and maybe, again, the bang for the buck, we could make more effort on that given day. There's probably a limit to what we can actually transport in a day. In this case, we had quite a huge hauling trailer in the upper right there, but we've downsized that. It was just too large.
Well, in our community, the school system campus is one large site with lots and lots of grass, and there's no shooting on school property, and consequently then the roundup would be, seems to me to be the primary
Is the school property,
strategy.
I heard a lot of birds there. Is it generally giant birds at the school, do you believe? Or is there some decoying in the fall?
Oh, there's some decoying in the fall, but you're not
Just to
gonna
the water bodies?
Pardon?
We're not targeting minor birds, but
You're not gonna do a roundup in the fall.
Mhm.
You're gonna do that.
our
in the
roundup is
summertime.
the last week of June.
Yeah.
Right,
See,
and
there's a pond right next to
Yeah.
the school property that I know has 2 or 3 nests on every year, plus, you know, so those birds can walk right from the
There-
pond up to the
There
grass.
must be a larger water body than that there, because that
Well,
wouldn't
that's
account for.
probably, what is that, 15 acres?
No, but they're
Well,
coming
that
from,
swamp
for a
goes
mile
on.
over.
Yeah.
They're flying in there too.
Oh,
no,
sure.
walk in.
Yeah.
But
But the
also,
river is
there are no kids, or very few kids, in the buildings and on the grounds during the summer. And so once school starts, then that takes care of part of the problem.
Okay. And that's another thing that'll have to be considered here. This doesn't show all of Amery even, but you look at that, there's a reason there's geese here now. They enjoy features of the city that the people enjoy, the water. And that's always gonna be here, and so are geese. So you're probably gonna have to decide where they can be and not pose big problems, and where you need to trim numbers. Because all 13 parks are probably not an option.
Where do they tend to nest? I live on the river, so there are a lot of reeds along the river, stumps a little ways out into the river. Will they go very far on land or not to nest, or do they try to stay away from the predators?
Yes.
They're typically are gonna nest fairly close to water, or on a little point, or a muskrat house, or a beaver lodge, maybe a stump that's a big one.
Yeah.
But they'll also nest on land, and sometimes substantial distance from them. But just a little pond.
Islands, peninsulas.
Would they be in some places that maybe a loon would go? I mean, they go out and kind of, block
Yeah.
No, they'd
maybe away from them.
a loon would not be in any, well,
They would be right, almost on the water.
a loon's gotta be a big body of water to
Yeah.
take off.
typically they're right that far off the water, right?
Yeah, they're right there. A goose is a lot more adaptable in its site selection for nesting. But the areas John just said are the first areas to target. And I'm sure in your minds you're picturing all these spots. And some of you even know exactly where some nests already are. But you really learn that once you kind of start, you know, most of you just...
Stan, you've got the whole Beaver Brook flowage. See, that's just right there.
Most people hardly even know where
so-
the nest exists until one day they see a brood behind a pair or in between a pair. And it's where'd they come from? Well, they purposely stayed low-key. They didn't want anything to come get them.
The oiling of the eggs now, do people have to be trained to do this, or?
Yes, but that's a very quick procedure. That's very...
You have to have a permit
You have to have the permit.
from DNR.
Okay.
And
So I can't
generally...
just go out there and do it?
No.
My nest? Okay.
No.
If the city gets the permit though, is there a limit on, I mean, do we have to list the people that are gonna do it?
Yeah, I believe they try to list the participants on the permit.
Okay.
Requires a free permit and registration. It requires two processes. The state actually issues the permit now. It isn't done through the Fish and Wildlife Service. But you have to register with them on a site, and then you have to report to them at the end of the permit period. You report nests taken and eggs.
So when you say site, I mean, is Amery a site, or do you have to have specific locations within the city limits of
Well,
Amery?
that's what it gets addressed on the permit when applying. And that's done with us when we send your permit in. We work with you on where that site is. They have become quite generalized. They're not as specific as they used to be. All city-owned lands and adjacent private lands with property owner permission. That's pretty wide open.
When you look at Amery, that's a lot of land.
That's a lot of land.
And then did you say the permit actually has the individuals listed by name who can go out there and do the oil?
Yeah, the permit will be issued to a person. It's generally a city employee who's in charge of stuff. Then that permit will list likely participants that you'll be using.
So it's not bad.
And what's the time frame as far as applying for that permit?
You can apply today, tomorrow, but it's valid during a certain,
It's typically
I can't remember.
take a couple weeks to get, or a month, or 2 months, or?
Yeah, less than a month.
Is there a cost?
No.
Just for the oil.
Yeah.
The cost is, it takes time. You'll need a few, as you see, you'll need a few components, but not much. You need a bottle of corn oil. Sometimes a Sharpie is not a bad idea. I'm seeing more and more places label, you can't see it, but it is right there. They're labeling the date because we're starting to recommend 2 visits, especially if you found the nest. It can verify your success, and sometimes a retreatment's necessary. So anyway, and also if you have more than one party, it says, oh, this nest was done. Otherwise you have no idea if it was done.
How do you know a retreatment is necessary?
Well, you really don't know that, other than if you got there and there was no markings, you know when it wasn't done by anybody, and you should treat it. And
Yeah.
remember we said there's variations in nesting time. Maybe a nest was destroyed, so you might find nests that happened later. Because you're gonna ask me, when should you do this? And that's why I would say 1 early, 1 late, and you might encompass more nests then. I don't know if the age of birds has any factor in when they nest, or I don't know the factors, but there is variations a little bit. We will round up goslings of the year that look almost like an adult, and then we will grab fuzzy yellow birds this big. There's a lot of variation even the end of June. So, and they need to be handled differently. Actually, a couple times we've had humane representatives accompany us, and we need to create those birds differently, or the larger birds will trample younger birds. So,
Is there a window of time in the season for oiling the eggs too? Do Do you?
Yes, there is. It can only be done when the nests are there.
Yeah, but I mean, it's not like from, March 1st to March 30th or something like that.
I believe the permits are valid March 1st to like May 30th or something. It's a pretty good window. And it would encompass the only realistic time span.
Okay.
Yeah. We were kind of on this. We already know most of these things. What after a roundup, what can you see or expect? Well, immediately sometimes if this flock is gone on this golf course, you notice it the next day. There's no question about it, especially after you've been watching it for months. Sometimes doing that allows some of those other things that I showed you to work, harassing, shooting. Once season starts, you certainly aren't looking at as big a task anymore. Some of the decoying factors, maybe that site won't attract as many. Even our residents seem to they go through this seasonal cycle, and you see, if you watch them or not, you see things change. You see flying increase. You see 2-time-a-day feedings maybe for higher protein foods. And you just might decoy less birds at that time of the year. Your egg oiling can then start to look successful if you're trimming mortality. Put it this way, you do a removal and you don't attempt any egg oiling. Forget it, we're gonna be right back to this spot in not very long. And all these processes really need to be involved. And we've been talking questions, but pretty much the end. Folks. That first one's pretty key. I deal with this a lot. Excuse me, in agricultural settings. I'll get the call from field damage quite late. Once there is a brood in goslings, forget the harassment, forget all of that. They're there to stay. They're there to stay until flight happens or we do a roundup. Okay? It's a whole different ballgame at that point. If you really want to harass birds, it should start when they're sitting on the edge of the lawn on March 5th or whenever that begins. Last year, remember our March?
Yeah.
It was probably February 29th. Was it a leap year last year? Yeah. Yeah, so it's going to start happening very soon. I've been watching a large wintering flock on the Red Cedar River and Rice Lake, and every time it thaws enough that river opens further, they're in a different spot. They're just getting antsy. They're getting that time. Has anyone heard the Cardinals doing the territorial song? I just heard it 2 days ago. Tonight. It's a great song.
I've had two males with one female about a week now at my house.
But they started their main territorial chatter.
Yeah.
I got one retarded robin.
Stays
there all winter.
So this is just kind of a summary of what I pretty much went through. This might be one to remember too. But hey, let's face it, humans are, especially natural resource management, we're very reactive. We're seldom proactive in most cases. We wouldn't be sitting here today if there was 50 geese in Amery. So, I don't know, it's hard to be proactive.
Well, it's nice. I was probably 35 years old before I saw my first goose close enough to be able to hunt it. Now, they go from an extremely valued resource to pest really quick.
Well, and maybe I didn't mention this yet, but they are still highly valued by a lot of people. And your decisions and your actions are going to have to address everybody's thoughts, and there will be feelings on the subject too. Okay, not everyone is highly objective and educated like John on the subject. It'll be out of feeling. So you'll be surprised at that.
I think we were all surprised at how unanimous the folks that showed up at the hearing were for controlling them.
Well, then that's good. That I guess helps you at this point decide what to do, probably.
And it wasn't just that meeting. We had a meeting on the beach this last summer,
And that was a reoccurring thing. The geese, and they kept talking about how bad the geese were. The ducks, they have a great life because nobody hates them, it's just the geese, because they're the problem.
I didn't discuss the problems, that the consequences of it and the problems much, because we kind of know that, but there is and I don't know if this is happening in any of your parks, but we typically get involved somewhere at a municipality or a park, because basically the use of that site is done. Humans either don't want to or cannot use that due to geese. And what is the cost of non-use? You're still spending all this dollar to maintain the site for something, and then nobody can use it. It comes at a high price. I'm mainly talking beaches, or in Rice Lake, if you're familiar, it's the waterfront. It's a long park that runs for a long ways, and they watch fireworks there. And I overheard this the year after the geese were rounded. Someone said, "Isn't it nice that we can put a blanket here on the grass again?" You could not put and sit on that grass. It just, if you did it, you needed to be examined. So anyway, there's still geese there. There are still geese there, but that waterfront, this long stretch, it has some use back again.
That's what we're looking for.
Yeah, because we have areas like that already.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Nice to meet you.
Good.
Thank you, Chad.
Any other questions?
Questions for Chad?
What's that oil? It's corn oil, you said?
I think we should apply for that right away.
If the city wishes to address that, they can call our office. We'll get the process started.
Nests in front of Aquinas House, that'll be a
Well,
start.
they're down at the end of the golf course, right down there.
They gotta be on the golf course by those.
I found the remains of 2 nests out on the island when I was out there
Okay.
trapping and hunting. There was one that still had an egg,
Okay.
which I'm surprised that the predator didn't find that egg, because there was coon and otter and everything else.
Predators do
That's
find
the
them.
island in Salt Wind?
Huh?
The island in Salt Wind?
Yeah.
I was wondering, one of the lake that we're talking about is the smaller in town, and that's where the beach is. And we have, between the ducks and the geese, we've had water itch there like forever. We used to spray for it and we don't now. Would trying to get rid of these things help it a lot? So they break that cycle of that
Maybe.
parasite going.
That's probably fulfilling its life cycle off of another host.
Well, I know the snails are
Yeah.
part of it.
That lake.
And when when a lot of people use the beach, the deal was, when my kids were growing up, that you taught the kids to open their eyes underwater by picking up snails. So everybody went out with an ice cream bucket and picked up all the snails at the beach. So that, helped. But, I'm just wondering, would it help more if we got rid of it? Because we still had ducks and
The issue with South Twin is there were probably 40 days this year that there were at least 500 geese sitting on that lake.
If you believe what I put up here, that's potentially, all those droppings aren't probably going there if they're going somewhere else,
Yeah.
but it's still a lot of nutrients.
Well, they don't poop while they're sitting on the water, do they? Do they in the water? Oh, okay.
But we found that this last year that we did some work out there and cleaned up the beach a little bit, and nobody seemed to get water itch. There was a couple of people who called and said, I got it. But most people used the showers that we got there with some soap, and it seemed to help with.
It was probably because of other factors, and generally, if you had winds, it needs to move that water out of that area rather than pushing it in.
Yeah, the prevailing wind usually brings the water in.
I liked, if the geese, it doesn't matter the critter, because I deal with a lot of critters, but I'm more than willing to associate the blame to them when it's there. But I try not to over-exaggerate it. If it really isn't something to give them, there probably is enough just with what you have for real, you know what I mean? So overall water quality would probably improve, or at least it would help overall water quality. It may not improve, it could just depend if you had a 4-inch event that year, a 4-inch rainfall event that just flushed more nutrients than 200,000 geese could put into that system, you know, so.
For the 25 or 30 days that I watched 100 of them sitting on Joggish's lawn that slopes right down the south to him, I thought, you know, it seems to me like, you know, the migrants are pretty easy. You harass them about twice and they don't come back. I mean, I observed that on the river 20 years ago hunting them up there. When we would stand on the edge and wait for the geese to come off in the morning, we could shoot them 3 times a week the whole season, you know, because we sat up behind some hay bales and we had coffee, and when the geese would come up off the river, they'd come, if the wind was out of the northwest, they'd come right up, right over the top of us, and we could shoot a goose every, you know, 2 or 3 every time we went.
Doing that can then increase the effectiveness of non-lethal abatement. The stuff I showed you, the harassment techniques, all of a sudden that becomes effective again.
So I think we're on the right.
Is the camera still on?
Oh, yeah. I get up once in a while and adjust it.
Chad, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
And for the residents of the community, you can see that there are a number of different issues that are involved with maintaining the numbers, with reducing the numbers, with the time of year that's involved, and as Chad mentioned several times, his organization appreciates volunteer participation in the health, and particularly the rounding up and the identification of nesting sites. And so as you watch this now in the next couple of days, you will get some idea about what your involvement might be, and how the Goose Committee, which is in the process of being formed, will ask for your help in this project. And it's not, as Chad emphasized several times, it's not a one-time thing. And as we started to put this committee together, we identified a 5-year project. And so I hope that a number of you will be interested enough or have been negatively affected enough to participate in our project. So thank you very much. Thank John for his involvement in the beginning of this, and this will continue over the next several years.